Welcome, indie romance author EF Dodd. Yay!
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Sure. I am an indie romance author. I started my own imprint, Sugar Beaver Books, which is what releases all of my all of my books. Right now, my latest book, A Higher Standard, just came out on May 16th, and it's the first book in a series. And my other two books, Risky Restoration and Earning It, are part of a separate series. And then I have another book coming out this fall, and then plans for obviously future releases, fingers crossed if everything goes according to plan. Most of what I write is contemporary. I have a quote unquote real job. So the research that is required for historical romantic fiction, that's a lot more than I'm willing to bite off at this point. So we'll stick with contemporary for right now.
Well, and I love that you mentioned that this was part of a series that A Higher Standard, which just released, because you had so many awesome, cute little quirky characters in there. So I was
Thank
just
you.
like, it just reminded me so much of like a feel good rom-com that I just like, I really want to follow more of these characters.
Well, hopefully that'll happen. Fingers crossed.
Well, in the release in fall that you're looking at, is that part of this series?
That one is actually part of the first series. So the first series that I wrote, I call it Not Looking for Love. That's Risky Restoration is where it starts. And then Earning It is the second book. And that series involves three female friends, Kez, Ray, and V. So Kez was the first book, Ray was the second book, and then V will be the third book. So her book will come out, assuming I get it to my copy editor in time. Her book should come out around October.
Oh, nice. So were you writing both of the books at the same time?
For the love of God, yes.
Oh my gosh, you are a brave woman. You are so much braver than I am. I feel like I just like get, cross the streams too much.
It's hard. This is the first time that I've had two books come out in 1 year. Because with Risky, I started it essentially. It was an idea that I had kind of floating around in the back of my mind. And then COVID happened, and I had kind of dabbled here and there, written a few pages, paragraphs, whatever. And I thought, you know what? Why not? If there's a time to put your little warm fingers on that keyboard and crank this out, this is probably a good one. So I did that, and then, finished it up, and the flow on that one was pretty good. And so I had basically the start of the second book right after I finished that book. And so Earning It came pretty quickly right after that. And then A Higher Standard came about really because I wasn't sure what direction to go with the third book in the Not Looking for Love series with V's book. And so I did the responsible thing and said, well, I just won't worry about that. I'll write something else. So that's what started A Higher Standard. But then, so I started writing these once I was working through developmental edits of A Higher Standard. And it is complicated. I understand fully why a lot of authors say I'm one book a year and that's it, because writing one while developmentally editing another, and then, trying to keep all that straight, and this world is over here and this is over there. It's a complicated thing. So I don't know that I don't want to call it a mistake, but I don't know that I'll bite off that much again.
Yeah, writing one book a year is already a task in itself, much less
it really is.
two.
It really is. Like I say, I completely understand why people only do one a year. It just doesn't. It's because it's a lot. And I didn't know anything about any of that process when I first started. I just thought, well, you write it and then it comes out. But obviously, that's not the case.
Well, and while you were writing A Higher Standard, did you go into it thinking, or maybe in the midst of writing it, think that, oh, I'm going to make this a series?
I wasn't sure when I started it. I honestly thought it would be a standalone. But then as I got further into it, because I am not a person who outlines all of their book. I think it's great if you can do that. I applaud you. You have much better control than I do. I usually will start with an idea and kind of sketch it out. This is kind of what I want it to look like, a very basic. A lot of times it's not even written down anywhere except on like the notes in my iPhone, and it's just super basic, a few sentences, and then I take that and just start writing. That's the process that works for me. I can't, if I outline it, I find myself getting too in depth in the outline, and I'm basically writing the book anyway. So with A Higher Standard, it came about because we adopted an English bulldog from a local rescue in August of 2021. And we had bulldogs before, but we had never gotten one that was a rescue. I had grown up with, going to the Humane Society and getting a dog, or, strays that would wander up. And so we did that. And I had no idea really the effort and work that is required of all these volunteers for these different animal rescues. And it's true volunteer work. They don't get paid anything. Like, they exist solely on donations and people willing to just donate their time, their houses to, for these dogs to stay in, to foster until they get adopted. And, some of these dogs have some pretty significant health issues, and they fund that and they pay for it. And so I thought, if there was ever anything where there was a book, it's something like this, because there's just so much there to write about. And it's just the people that you meet through rescue are really interesting folks, and they're just good people. And so I thought, that would be a really good setting for a romance. And so that's kind of where it started with me.
Well, and I love that you bring that up, because in your latest release, The Higher Standard, it does take place in rural North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And you very much have like the opposites attract, with like the businessman and the horse rancher who like butt heads, but they can't deny those intense feelings. So like, you wrote that book in a very clever way. I love how you utilize and interwove the setting as like part of the plot as well. So when you were writing that setting, like, that was, whereas it always going to be the method that I'm going to interweave this as part of the plot? When you said, I like the bulldog and I'm going to use this as fodder for my next romance.
Well, the setting, and this is obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, this is not my own thought. Someone in a writing class said this, and I can't remember who it was, but it's basically, the setting in a lot of books is like another character, because it plays such an important role in the story. And for me, where I live in North Carolina, it is rural. I lived in Charlotte for many years, and then I moved out into a more rural area. But the urban sprawl is headed this way. And Charlotte, I think, especially during COVID, was one of the fastest growing places in the nation. And so that was, I wanted to capture some of that. On the one hand, it's absolutely great to be 5 minutes from 3 Harris Teeters. On the other hand, you're losing a lot of the character of a place if it just becomes subdivision after subdivision, and you're just clear cutting wide swaths of land for development. And so I wanted to make that kind of be a theme in the book too, because it is important to preserve these rural areas. As I'm not against progress, but I also don't want everything to just be a postage stamp of something else. And so I tried to make Mimosa be, a unique place that maintained some of its character. And it was important to me that Gideon, as the big shot developer, that was a challenge for me, because in this day and age, a real estate developer is very rarely the hero of any story. They are the evil villain that comes to town. And so I wanted to make sure that he wasn't somebody that needed to change who he was. I mean, he was the same guy. He just changed his plan. And to me, that was more realistic than something you might get and I love a Hallmark movie just as much as the next person. But it's, it's not like he was walking away from his Peloton lifestyle and just completely changing his persona. He was still the same guy. He just realized that there were better opportunities to pursue in Mimosa instead of the plan he originally had, which was start from the ground up. There were roots there that he could use to build into, to grow into something else.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's exactly where my mind went immediately, was the Hallmark movie. But like, I was just like, it's Hallmark, but like meet Sweet Home Alabama, where it's like you very much love these characters, and there's still a good, like you see inside of him, he's not like you said, greedy. The hero's not like greedy, or he's not trying to ruin anything. He's just doing his job, and he's still very much the same person inside. Like he just allows that to be more prominent, right, throughout the book.
Yeah, so that was kind of my goal for it.
Yeah, and the protagonist, too, Everest, kind of brings that out in him. She
tries.
Oh, and she's feisty too. I do love her. I'm not gonna
lie. Yeah. She was fun to write. She was really fun to write. I enjoyed that. And I grew up with horses. My parents still have 8 at this point, and they're in their late 70s. So horses have always been a pretty big part of my life, and and that was the reason that I did an equine rescue instead of something with dogs or smaller animals, because cats and dogs get a lot of attention. Sarah McLachlan, that song, you can't hear it without thinking of some desperate animal in dire need of your help. But what a lot of people don't understand, because you don't see a stray horse, you'll see a stray dog or a stray cat, so that that's an issue. But until some of these hoarding cases make the news, or every year around the Kentucky Derby, people start talking about the mistreatment of horses in horse racing. But it's just kind of little blips of, well, this is happening, and then it just kind of disappears. And so, unfortunately, it's a real issue, because it's a huge animal. It's a huge responsibility. It's a huge commitment, and it's a huge expense if you take care of them the way they need to be. And so that was why I wanted to make sure it was something that maybe wasn't in the forefront of people's minds, as I say, like cats and dogs. The horse rescue really drives home that, there's other animals out there. There's lots of farm animals out there that need help too. It's not just the cute little puppy on the TV.
Well, and when you frame it like that, like in my mind, I was thinking that it kind of brought out more of the rural setting when I think of horses, because my friends I actually grew up kind of in a smaller town too. And some of my friends lived out more towards the country. So they had horses. I live near, Fort Worth, Texas. So the rodeo is a big deal. So I have family members who have horses and stuff like that. And I know what a big commitment, and sometimes how forgotten they can be, because I know, like you said, race horses too. Like there's a racetrack not too far from in Dallas area. So it's one of those things that kind of drove home that rural setting. So it reminded me a lot of my friends and how they were so good with horses, and they kind of lived out in that nice kind of quiet country area.
And I think the rural setting is, I don't want to say it's hard to do, but it's harder to do it so it doesn't look like a caricature, if that makes sense. So that it feels like this could be a real place, and these people are real, and it's not just, a bunch of people shuffling around in overalls getting in their pickup trucks. Really what I tried to do in this book was to make it seem like a real place with, real people, and they weren't just stereotypes. They were, people that you would find in any small town.
You incorporated so many cool, interesting details in what life in the country kind of would look like. And especially when talking about like the horses, kind of like you mentioned, because I knew some of the terminology mentioned, because I don't know a whole lot about horses, but I remember my friends talking about them. I remember meeting the horses quite a bit. So I never rode one. I cannot say I shared that, but I did get to I got to pet them. I got to help take care of them sometimes when we went out to their place. But readers get to experience the radical differences through the lens of Gideon, like you said, kind of this big city protagonist, someone who's from the like Boston, who may not know what it's like to, ride a horse, as we see in the intro. So, do you?
Yeah, and it really is kind of a shock to, because I have good friends that are from the city, and they, from New York or Boston or whatever, and the way I grew up is so foreign to them. I mean, I might as well have been on some other planet. And it's, like there's a scene in the book where Everest is replacing the blades on a lawnmower. And there's people, some of the friends of mine that have read it or that, have looked at some of these scenes. Some of the guys said, well, I didn't even know that was a thing you could do, because they've never had to do it. They've never, some of my good friends who are from, a lot of them are from up north. They didn't live in a house. They lived in an apartment. So they didn't have, their dad didn't mow the lawn. Their dad didn't have a lawnmower. They didn't have any of this stuff. And so, yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to use, was to emphasize the differences through scenery rather than, just saying city guy, country girl.
Right. And like you said, I think it was such an important and great aspect that you added all these quirky, kind of really lovable characters, as kind of like the supporting cast, because I feel like that really kept the momentum of, because I feel like sometimes in a rural setting, you have to be careful because it can get a little boring or mundane, but you really kept that momentum between like taking care of, like you said, the equine rescue and all these wonderful supporting characters that you added into the book. That's why I was so excited you said it was a series.
Yeah, I think for me, sometimes writing some of these side characters is almost as much fun as writing for the main characters, because you have a little bit more freedom with those folks. I mean, they're not the focus of the story. They can be a little bit zanier, or they can be, they can have a little bit of a stronger of opinion, or what have you. And they just really add, I think, layers to a story, because I think the difference between romance now and romance, say, I don't know, 20 years ago, at least in the books that I remember reading, you didn't have these, like the female main character wouldn't have a big group of friends. She would be kind of, on an island to herself. And then she would just assimilate into the male main character's life. He might have friends, but, she's just this kind of island onto herself. And I think it's important in a romance, well, really, from my perspective, in any book that you write, I think female friendships are really the foundation of a lot of really good books. And the relationship between the women and their friends is equally as important, obviously for different reasons, but equally as important between, as the relationship she develops with the main male character, with the love interest. And I think a lot of people have seen that even more now since COVID, the importance of having that connection, the importance of having that friend group, and finding ways to just stay connected with those people is just as important as staying connected to your romantic partner.
And actually, now that you mention that, reminds me so much of an episode I did actually about cozy mystery, because you do the same thing that I think of when I think of like my small town. Me and my husband both grew up in small towns, is that you kind of built your own community.
Yes.
And especially in this book, which was really, I think, what I saw in it as far as when I was reading it, because it just reminded me, like, I know someone like that. I do know someone from my town from like that. That's just like that.
Sure. I mean, we all do. Yeah.
Exactly. And you built this wonderful little community where like, and they were so interconnected. And that's what I saw a lot growing up. It was like, you kind of just had like, you knew a lot of your neighbors, you knew a lot of the people around town that you saw all the time. My aunt did very much because she was a real estate agent. So she knew like everybody in town. And
sure.
So it's like, it felt very much like that, like this very tight knit community. And like something that was, like you said, kind of foreign to someone, maybe a little more foreign to someone in the big city, but like very much part of like what I consider like a staple of the rural setting.
Yeah. I mean, when the town I grew up in, my high school, I went to school with the same class of people from first grade all the way through senior year. I mean, we had a few people come in, that would move, and then things like that. But I mean, for the most part, you saw the same people growing up every day, day in, day out. And, you know, you would see them at the grocery store, or you would see them at the 2 or 3 restaurants that you've got, or you would, you know, and these places like the coffee shop in a higher standard, they really are kind of the hub of the community. You know, you go in there to get your news. You go in there to make sure Mr. So-and-so is feeling okay, or Mrs. Such and such doesn't need any help with X, Y, or Z. And so I think it's important to have that community center, because that helps keep the town alive, I think.
Very much so. And did you face any writing challenges when it came to creating kind of the rule setting in this little tight-knit community when you were working on a higher standard?
Well, I think the hardest thing for me was to make Gideon assimilate more into that community, because when I watch some of these, you know, Hallmark rom-coms or, you know, Hallmark Christmas movies, and the guy from New York all of a sudden decides that he's going to live in, you know, the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, just because it's so cute and has a such and such festival, that, you know, it lacks a little credulity. You know, it's a cute movie, it's a cute concept, but, you know, there needs to be more of a foundation laid for why they would move. And you can't, in reality, base a decision like that solely on your relationship with one other person. There has to be something else in that community that makes you want to go there. And so that was the challenge for me, was to make Mimosa a place that Gideon would want to go. So it couldn't be too isolated. You know, it had to be, in order for him to really want to be there, it needed to have at least proximity to another larger city. And so I tried to make sure that came through, because it's not like he's moving to a small town in the middle of nowhere. He still has opportunities. He's still within, you know, an hour's drive of a major airport. He's still within, you know, an hour's drive of great restaurants and things like that. So that was what I had to layer in, I think, and was one of the more difficult parts of it, was to make sure that Mimosa was a believable landing spot for him, and he wasn't just throwing it up in the air and saying, I love her, I'm moving there, regardless of where it is.
That's fair. Actually, that's a very good point, because if like obviously it doesn't, but if the romance had fizzled out, what else could tie that protagonist to that community or there?
And the side characters, I mean, not only did Gideon have to buy into his decision, I mean, his business partners had to as well. And I don't want to give too much away, but, there's parts in the book where they have to weigh in on certain decisions he's making. It's not like he can just say, no, well, this is happening. I mean, he has 2 partners that he works with, and they have to agree to certain choices. And you want that friendship group to be strong too, because and that was a fun thing I got to kind of to play with in this book, was the male friendship side of it. So it's not just Everest and her girlfriends in Mimosa. Gideon has his male, his close friends back up in Boston that he's been good friends with since college. And so you had to weave the dynamic of, they're not just happy for him because he's found this girl that he loves. They're happy for him because he's making a change in his life that's actually going to be truly beneficial. And it's not going to hurt the company that they've all worked to build. And everything comes up roses, which is obviously why it's fiction, but it helps it be more believable if everybody in the story can buy into the justifications for what they're doing.
And you created these great connections between all these points of these characters, and you kind of created your own distinct tone throughout the book, mentioning like how Everest had, her girlfriends, but Gideon also had his business partners who was also friends with, and all those connections throughout the community. Do you think the rule setting influenced your book's tone?
I think so, because I think it was easier, at least for me, I think it's easier to develop a sense of community in a small town book than it is for a book set in the city. I think you can develop a good friendship group set in the city. And I think that they can have their favorite haunts and they can have things that they like about it and they can love living there. But the community is much more about the people than the place, I think, when you're basing something in a city. The city is this beautiful backdrop for them to live their lives in. Whereas with a small town, it's really part of the story. Because there's more people, it makes more sense for the characters to have closer relationships with more people in a small town than it does in a big city. Because if you go, to the grocery store in the big city, well, the person at the checkout line is probably going to be different every time. Or you might go to 6 different grocery stores instead of the 1 or 2 that are available to you. And so I think the small town setting really makes it easier to develop a sense of community than in the city. And I think the other thing of it is that at least in my experience, a book that's set in a larger city, you have your work friends, you have your social friends, you have your people that go to the same gym, and it's very distinct groupings, and a lot of times they don't really intersect. But in a small town, well, all those people are the same people because it's small. You don't have these different segments of the population that you come into contact with. You just come into contact with the population of the small town.
That was something I was about to mention too, because since we moved out of our small towns, both me and my husband, when we moved kind of to a bigger metropolis, we were like, yeah, we're very segmented in who our friends are, as far as the work, like you said, the work friends, the gym friends, the church friends. But like, those are like all the friends when you have in small towns.
Yeah.
And then you usually come across their paths. Like every time I go back into our small town, like my mom still lives there. So if we ever go back, I always see someone I grew up with, like in the store, in the grocery store. And I'm always sitting there, like usually catching up with them.
Yeah. I mean, that happens anytime I go home, because my parents still live in my hometown too. And anytime I go home, I'll see somebody that I know from, when I was going to church there, when I was little, when I was in school, I'll see somebody that I know, or somebody's mom will say, oh, well, so-and-so wants to make sure that, I said hello, or such and such and so, or I'll see, my old high school algebra teacher or something, and you just don't really have that in a larger metropolis.
No, like even when I tell certain friends, like, oh, okay, I'm going to this big event, like in the city, like I'll be, surprised if I do see them, unless we are like distinctly say, okay, I'm here. Can you let's meet up or something like that? But I'm always running into somebody usually when I go back home.
Yeah.
So, and you present some pretty high stakes for both protagonists, right? To win over the potential love interest. Like there are some, like the land itself is kind of that part of that plot, like we mentioned. But you keep readers invested in the characters' connections throughout. How did you use the rural setting's tone to contribute to the romance as opposed to detract from it?
Well, I think for Everest, it was, she wanted to get in to understand that, this land, this town, this was pretty much part of her DNA. I mean, she wasn't going to leave it. And I think the hardest thing for her was she knew that, and she never wavered from that. And so that presented a conflict on her part, because she felt like, well, how can I ask him to do something I know I can't do? I'm not going to move. I can't move there. My business is not portable. I'm not just going to ship all these horses up to someplace right outside of Boston. And so I think her attachment to her hometown was a good external conflict for the book to kind of keep things invested as to, in her own inner turmoil. I really like this guy. I'd like to see where things can go, but where can they really go? Because I live here, he lives there, and I'm obviously not going there. And for Gideon, I think it was just it helped that the setting really helped open his eyes to a different lifestyle, and one that was that he could have, but he didn't have to completely give up his old life and find something completely new. He just had to sort of adapt his way of thinking about what he wanted to accomplish down there. And I think, again, the rural setting was key to that, because a lot of what you see in some of the smaller towns and more rural areas is you have these downtowns that were built in, 1886 or 1910 or what have you. And it's not just all new construction. It's buildings with character. And so I think that setting helped to open up Gideon's mindset as to what he was looking to do in Mimosa. And he saw this really cool architecture in these old buildings and the possibility to bring them back to life instead of going out and finding 100 acres of vacant land and just building brand new things.
I will say that was one of the things that really endeared me to Gideon, was the fact that he thought of like ways to like spruce these existing buildings up, as opposed to like tear them down and build something else, because there's so much character to some of those old buildings. I know, like,
absolutely.
Yeah. Were those kind of influenced by like the town you grew up in?
My hometown has an historic downtown, and there are houses. They do an historic homes tour. It's called the October Tour. And there's houses there that date from like the late 1700s. And the entire community is pretty invested in maintaining those places, and making sure the historic aspects of those are preserved. And then in the downtown, there are new buildings, quote unquote, but as far as, our Main Street, it's a historic Main Street, and, there's rules and regulations about what you can and can't do. And pretty much everything down there is a rehabbed old building.
That's good, at least, though. At least they're trying to preserve them.
Yeah.
I know, like in my husband's old town, there was this cute, oh my gosh, it was like probably almost 100 years old, a cute little old house that was like 2-3 stories. They just don't build them like that anymore. And it was kind of abandoned. And I was just like, the dream is to move in and make it a bed and breakfast. That was my dream.
Oh, sure.
But then it burned down because of an electrical fire. So, but it was just such a bummer that such a beautiful house like that just needed a little TLC ended up going under.
Yeah. And there's a development close to us where there was a house that it used to be all owned by the same family, and the house had been there for probably since about 1820, 1830. And instead of tearing it down, the developer just built the development around it. And so there's like a roughly 7 or 8 acre parcel in the center of this development that has this historic home, and it has the outbuildings out there. And so, there's it really, I like it when that happens, when people realize that you shouldn't just bulldoze over history and act like it never happened. Because
true.
A lot of the when they take the time to rehab these old buildings, they're just beautiful, because they don't make them like that anymore.
Right. Exactly. I know. I love one of the historic downtowns near me. It's actually in a much bigger area now. It's a college town, but it used to be a very old town, and it's a 1920s opera house, but they turned it into a used bookstore, but they pretty much kept the whole thing, the structure intact. And it's just so fun going in there, because they have so many little like coverts and little nooks and crannies, like just like random little closets with books in them. It's fascinating. It really is
cool. Yeah.
So when writing a higher standard, we've talked so much about the rule setting. Did you end up choosing the rule setting first, or did you kind of have the plot in mind first when you kind of approached the book?
I think for me, I think it kind of went hand in hand, because I knew I wanted to have this developer comes to town aspect of it. And in order to make that play, I knew it had to be in a rural area, because it just wouldn't be the same story if he were somewhere in a city looking to build something new. I mean, it would just be totally different. So, and I thought, some of me thought about, You've Got Mail in the shop around the corner where, Fox Books comes in and builds that huge mega store, and then she has to close her quaint little store. And so I thought a lot about, that and kind of the opposites attract thing. The thing that I don't like about You've Got Mail is that he puts her out of business and they're still like, I love you. It's just kind of like,
do you?
No, sorry. If you put me out of business, we're not going to be a thing. That's not how that works.
And of course, I have one of the most important questions. You mentioned a lot of this book kind of was spurred on by this idea of rescuing a little bulldog, right?
Yeah.
An English bulldog. So do you have pictures of him on your Instagram? Because I think I've seen spots of pictures, right?
Yes. Beef is he's very prominent on my Instagram.
Well, that's good to know because I love seeing pictures of doggies, and I love that.
Oh yeah, he's actually in
the
room right now. If you hear snoring, that's not me, that's him.
Oh, that's the bulldog for you, right?
Oh yeah,
just snoring. Where can listeners find your books, and how can they connect with you?
Sure. Well, all of my books are available on Kindle Unlimited. You can, if you're looking for paperbacks, you can buy them on Amazon. My website is let me just double check, efdoddwrites.com. And then on Instagram, it's e.f.dodd, EF Dodd. And it's the same on Facebook. And I have a Facebook author page, and if you just look up EF Dodd author, that'll pop up. I'm on Instagram a lot more than Facebook because Instagram makes more sense to me. So that's where you can find me. My books, like I say, are available. Amazon's your best bet because they'll get it to you the quickest, and it's on Kindle Unlimited.